Hello everyone and welcome to the second half of Modern Europe. I hope you had a fantastic reading week. In this module, we are going to see Europe go from a state of massive confidence to one of incredible pessimism, from the so-called Age of Optimism in the mid to late 19th century down to the terrible destruction of the First World War at the beginning of the 20th century. In this unit, Unit 7, we're going to begin by looking at this so-called Age of Optimism. This was an age that for many Europeans, it seemed like there was nothing that they couldn't achieve. And indeed, the Age of Optimism witnessed many major strides forward in scientific progress, changes to urban planning and urban sanitation, changes to medicine. We also saw the construction of massive new structures almost as a celebration of this European age, such as the Crystal Palace you see here, built in 1851, or the Eiffel Tower in Paris. Yet at the same time, this Age of Optimism was made possible by the terrible oppression of the imperialistic age, which we will be talking about in the next unit, where essentially European countries competed to take over other parts of the world and oppress it and drain it of resources. All of this was also going alongside a growing competition between European nations and a runaway rush to militarism, which would eventually lead to the outbreak of the First World War. But today we're going to start with the Age of Optimism. The learning objectives for this unit are: describe the Second Industrial Revolution and changes to transportation and industry. Articulate the changes to class divisions: poor, working class, middle class, and aristocracy. And finally, describe the urban transformation of the late 19th century. The Age of Optimism is sometimes referred to as the Victorian Age, named after Queen Victoria, who ruled for 63 years from 1837 to 1901. During the Victorian Age, we saw Europe completely transformed by the Industrial Revolution and by social change. We also saw Britain rise to become really the most powerful country in the world. The British Empire would eventually have 1/4 of the world's population technically owing allegiance to this woman right here, who stood just at 4 feet 11 inches tall. And during the Victorian Age, we would also see Europe enter into this period of confidence and scientific progress as well. So what sorts of things happened during the Age of Optimism? Well, for one thing, the 19th century saw the birth of photography. Here you see the famous Boulevard du Temple, a daguerreotype made by Louis Daguerre in 1838. And this is generally accepted as the earliest photograph to include people. Do you see them? They are right down here in the corner. It looks like someone shining somebody else's shoes. So a shoe shining boy and a man standing there. And the reason why this picture captured them and nobody else is because they were the ones that stood still long enough to be captured in this image. You see, the exposure times of early photographs took a very long time, and we believe this photograph took about 10 minutes to expose. So anything that was moving during that time generally wasn't captured. Or were they? This was a picture in downtown Paris, and you'd expect it to be more busy during the day. And indeed, we do see some blurring along the street here, which seems to suggest that probably there were carriages and people moving by, but they didn't stand still long enough to be captured in the frame. And so we are left with just these two ghostly individuals down here as the very first people to ever be captured in a photograph. Now, photography is just one example of the types of scientific advancements that were made during the 19th century, which marked the Age of Optimism in Europe. Another example is the birth of trains and the railroad. Here you see a drawing of September 27th, 1825, and the opening of the Stockton and Darlington Railway, the world's first public railway. This is, in fact, essentially the first type of public transportation. And, we complain about crowded TTC subway cars today. My goodness, people had to sit in the open on these sort of wagons that were being pulled by the train. In any respect, railroads and trains, this marked a massive advancement in the Industrial Revolution. It allowed people and goods to move from one part of Europe to another part of Europe in lightning speeds compared to what had been the case before. So again, this is another example of these big leaps forward that were happening during the Age of Optimism. Another example is the massive undertaking of canal building around the world, and the biggest of them all was the Suez Canal, which was opened in 1869. This canal cut through over 100 miles of Egyptian desert and enabled passage between the Mediterranean and the Red Seas. It reduced by half the voyage from Europe to India and the rest of Asia, and this, of course, particularly benefited Britain. The Suez Canal exemplified the speeding up of transportation and communication in the second half of the 19th century. The publishing of Jules Verne's book Around the World in 80 Days in 1872 exemplified these massive changes in the speed of transportation and communication around the world. What you see here is an image from a French board game which was based on Jules Verne's novel, and it illustrates the speed at which a steam locomotive with all its new technology could move people around the world, suggesting as well the technological power to colonize exotic territories. And all of this, of course, would underpin the European drive of the second half of the 19th century to form colonies and empires, ultimately oppressing the rest of the world's population. And nothing epitomized the changes in communications technology more than the telegraph. The telegraph was developed in the 1830s and 1840s by Samuel Morse and other inventors, and this revolutionized long-distance communication. It worked by transmitting electrical signals over wire laid between stations. In addition to helping invent the telegraph, Samuel Morse developed a code bearing his name that assigned a series of dots and dashes to each letter of the English alphabet and allowed for the simple transmission of complex messages across telegraph lines. In 1844, Morse sent his very first telegraph message from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore, Maryland, and by 1866, a telegraph line had been laid across the Atlantic Ocean from the USA to Europe. Although by the end of the 20th century, the telegraph had pretty much fallen out of use and replaced by the telephone, it laid the groundwork for the communications revolution that would lead to later innovations such as the internet today. As we talked about in the first half of the course, industrialization had led to a massive shift to urbanization as millions of people in the Western world moved from the countryside into cities. The second half of the 19th century witnessed a transformative phase of improvements to urban design. We see the introduction of sewer systems throughout cities. We see the introduction of things like running water, and eventually we see gas lighting and then later electricity in cities. All of this is being made possible by something that we will be talking about today called the Second Industrial Revolution. However, underpinning the Age of Optimism was a much more terrible reality for much of the rest of the world's population. As European countries grew in power, they began to stretch their might in forming empires around the world, and millions of people were oppressed along the way. European countries justified their exploitation by ideas that were rooted in racism, such as the concept called the white man's burden, which we'll be talking about in the next unit. Needless to say, the Age of Optimism was only for a select few in Europe, and much of the rest of the world was being oppressed at the exact same time. Even within Europe, the Age of Optimism was not equally felt. The age also masked continued poverty for the working and lower classes. Here you see in 19th century London children huddled together for warmth in an alleyway, and scenes such as this would continue throughout the so-called Age of Optimism. Okay, so now let's pause for a moment and do a little bit of review. In order to understand how we got to this so-called Age of Optimism, we have to understand the Industrial Revolution. Now, if you recall, I argued that the Industrial Revolution was the most important change to happen to human beings since the Agricultural Revolution around 10,000 years ago. The Agricultural Revolution, of course, was what first allowed us to settle down into small settlements and eventually cities with the invention of farming. Well, the Industrial Revolution would transform our lives in an equally massive way. It resulted in rapid and massive social change and a worldwide human shift to urban society. We also saw an explosion of population and overall a rise in the standard of living. The Industrial Revolution could be thought of as a shift from the use of animal and human power, along with wind and water in a limited fashion, to using fossil fuels as the energy with which we do things and make things. However, around 1850, the Industrial Revolution enters into a new phase, something that historians sometimes refer to as the Second Industrial Revolution. The Second Industrial Revolution saw new sources of energy. Instead of coal, we now see the beginning of the use of petroleum or oil and the introduction of electricity. We also see new products being used, such as chemicals, steel, and aluminum. Science becomes a major partner in industrial development. And really, in the Second Industrial Revolution, we see everything become faster. We see more products being produced, we see more factories being built, and we see the process of urbanization pick up even more. If you recall, when I first introduced you to the Industrial Revolution, I suggested that prior to the Industrial Revolution, society was marked by scarcity to a certain degree. Scarcity in goods. Because we didn't have factories, we just didn't have much stuff. Even if you were wealthy, there wasn't much stuff to buy. Well, this has all changed by the second half of the 19th century, especially by the Second Industrial Revolution, which has sped everything up. The economy has grown by tenfold, and now we start to see the beginnings of a new type of consumerism. We see new types of consumption, such as department stores and mail order systems, so that people can buy all these new products which now exist. Here you see a picture of Le Bon Marché, which was founded in 1838 in Paris, and it was one of the very first department stores in the world. We also saw an expansion in credit and world trade. Credit was now being offered for entrepreneurial projects as the economy was being greased by new banks emerging at the same time. We see, in essence, the birth of modern consumerism in the second half of the 19th century. Now you can look at something in a catalog and order it, and it will arrive in the mail. Not that different from purchasing something on Amazon today. Mail order was possible because of the development of standardized postal systems in Europe. Here you see an example in 1840 of the penny post stamp, which prompted an unprecedented expansion in the popularity of mail as suddenly sending mail became so much more affordable and something that was not just reserved for aristocrats. We also saw the dramatic expansion of the railway. The railway didn't just allow people to move, it allowed goods to move, and it allowed the mail to move from one part of Europe to another part of Europe. As we were discussing earlier, canal building was another massive improvement in transportation. The Suez Canal in 1869 linked finally the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, and we see the introduction of steamships as well. All of this improving and speeding up the rate of transportation around the world. It's in the mid-19th century that we first see the first prototypes of artificial refrigeration. Eventually, this would lead to the ability to keep food fresh over long distances. When you go into a grocery store today, you probably think nothing of the fact that we can have strawberries from California and avocados from Mexico in the frigid cold of winter. Those sort of developments wouldn't have been possible had it not been for the massive changes taking place in the mid-19th century. And we also see the expanding telegraph networks eventually giving way to the telephone in 1879. I've said before that this course really could be subtitled as the story of the rise of the middle class. This new group of people which emerged really in the 12th century in the Middle Ages, only small in numbers then, but had been growing in the centuries since, finally in the 19th century really starts to settle into positions of power, and this comes at the expense of the old aristocracy. With the growth of industry, landed wealth becomes less and less important. So what do I mean by landed wealth? I mean the inherited wealth and privileges that were afforded to the aristocratic class, privileges and wealth that were tied very particularly to the ownership of land. However, the Industrial Revolution really made whole new groups of people wealthy and afforded them power as well too. By the mid-19th century, for example, we now had universal male suffrage in many places. Suffrage is the right to vote. And so in the mid-19th century now, a man, regardless of how much money they made and regardless of what class they were born into, could vote. We really start to see the lines between the aristocracy and the upper middle class begin to blur. However, we also should point out that within the middle class, we also start to see a lot more gradations with respect to this distribution of wealth. So it's really the industrial expansion is benefiting the upper echelons of the middle class, the factory owners, the entrepreneurs, and the managers, those that Karl Marx would refer to as the bourgeoisie. In the mid-19th century, we also start to see a steadily growing number of occupations become professionalized, requiring very specific credentials. Lawyers, medical doctors, architects, engineers, scientists, teachers, these all become very controlled and regulated professions of the middle class. And particularly in Britain, culturally, we see in the 19th century a new, distinctly Victorian set of values. Values that were overall somewhat conservative in terms of morals and had very strictly regulated gender roles and expectations that members of the Victorian were expected to adhere to. Here you see a political cartoon ridiculing to a certain extent those same Victorian values by the famous French caricaturist Honoré Daumier from 1857. The French at the bottom of the cartoon reads that the chickens think that they have found the cage where they spent their early childhood. This is, of course, making fun of crinolines or hoop skirts, which first appeared in Paris in 1855, and in many ways they reflected this middle-class opulence of the Victorian era, and in many ways also the impracticality of female clothing and these new entrenched gender roles. They would remain in fashion for 10 years. Honoré Daumier became famous during the 19th century for his social and political criticism through caricature. Yet, just as Victorian ideals subjugated women to very strict gender rules, we also start to see a pushback as well. Here you see an image from ladies bicycling fashion, and this new mode of transportation, the bicycle, suggested possibilities for female emancipation. Free on her bicycle, the young woman is contrasted with the man who only rides a tricycle in this cartoon from the mid-19th century. And of course, during the mid-19th century, as men were finally achieving universal suffrage, there were many women trying to achieve it for their sex as well. The female suffrage movement would be a constant theme, particularly in the late 19th century, although really suffrage would only be achieved after World War I for women. Nevertheless, the new technological developments of the 19th century did open up new employment opportunities for women. For example, telephone operators really remained a completely feminized profession in the 19th century. And this, of course, was the first step towards more and more independence for women in their own economic spheres. Now, the Industrial Revolution and the 19th century had seen some improvement in living conditions. However, poverty still remained widespread and concentrated in urban environments. Working class people still struggled to survive. In the mid-19th century, however, there were developments to improve public health and safety. For example, the introduction of running water. Here you see an artist's impression of the building of a sewer in 19th century lighting. We also start to see the introduction of gas lighting on streets, later to be replaced by electric lighting. We also see policing for the first time. It may surprise you that the idea of having police officers available to the public was not something which generally existed prior to the 19th century. We also start to see improvements in public transportation with trams and eventually underground railways, which we would call subways. An example of the transformation of the urban environment is Georges Eugene Haussmann and his transformation of Paris in the mid-19th century. So the mid-19th century, Paris was really generally considered to be dank and crowded and unhealthy. And what Haussmann did under the support of the government, under the leadership of Napoleon III, was essentially create those grand boulevards that are so familiar if you visit Paris today. Unfortunately, the way that they did it is by essentially ridding whole neighborhoods of poor people, kicking them out, leveling their buildings and their houses to create these beautiful grand boulevards that are there today. But nevertheless, it was an attempt in the 19th century to clean up cities, to make them more open, airy, and light, and to sort of do away with what was thought of as the leftover medievalisms of places like Paris. Here you see a painting by Camille Pissarro, one of the leading impressionists of the mid-19th century, and he's portraying one of those new broad Parisian avenues designed by Haussmann. In this case, the avenue is leading to an opera house in the background. Notice you also see plenty of pedestrian and equestrian traffic representing the hustle and bustle of the mid-19th century city. One of the most remarkable developments that came out of the second half of the 19th century and the Age of Optimism was the rise of public education. Education prior to the 19th century really had been a private affair and something that was really only afforded to people who had the means to pay for it. There was no type of public education in the Middle Ages, for example, or the early modern period. However, the increasing complexity of society during the Industrial Revolution, accompanying the massive social changes such as the quest for universal suffrage, the growing involvement of the middle class in political affairs, nationalism, and the professionalization of many jobs such as doctors and lawyers, all led to a gradual acceptance in European society that education should be become a role of the state, that the state has a role to play in public education. And by 1870, most European nations are increasingly offering some form of free primary education, that is, education for younger children. Secondary education options are increasing in the 19th century. They generally, though, are still things that you would have to pay for. And overall, most of the public education was being directed towards the middle and the upper classes. But nevertheless, there really is a shift that is happening. So, for example, you see here an image of a so-called ragged school. Ragged schools were charitable organizations which were dedicated to the free education of destitute children in 19th century Britain, and the schools were developed in working class districts. They were intended for the children of the most destitute, and they were called ragged because the children, of course, were wearing rags, and they didn't want those children mixing with the better off children of those with means. All of this rise of public education, it plays an important role in making professionalization possible. So in our economy today, most jobs have become professionalized, meaning that there is an expectation of some form of education behind it. And this is the beginning of that process. So as we've already said, there were also many developments in science during the second half of the 19th century. And one theme which seems to ride through it all is positivism. Positivity or positivism is this idea that scientific inquiry drives human progress, and that more importantly, science can solve all of our problems and will solve all of our problems ultimately. And this is a belief that really becomes challenged once we reach World War I, when we see how all of these new scientific discoveries have led to weapons which cause bloodshed on a scale unseen before. But until we reach that moment in time, really during the 19th century, there is this belief that science can only do good, and that the more we discover, the better our lives will be. Probably the most important scientist of the 19th century is Charles Darwin, and his publication of On the Origin of Species really changed everything. It changed the way we look at ourselves and our connection to the world and the universe. Charles Darwin had put forth the idea that humans, and indeed all life on Earth, had evolved over time through natural selection. And this challenged religious doctrine. It challenged everything to the core of society in terms of how the world operated. Other developments include Dmitri Mendeleev and the development of the periodic table of elements, Louis Pasteur, who discovered the principles of bacterial infection and vaccination, and of course Joseph Lister, who pioneered the idea of sterilizing equipment and antiseptic surgery. Who would have thought that it was important to wash your hands and wash your knives before you conduct surgery? Well, these were new ideas during the 19th century. So all of this was part of this positive momentum of science, which we see during the Age of Optimism. So not everyone was ready to accept all these new ideas, particularly Darwin's theory of evolution, which, although it made Darwin a celebrity, it also made him an object of scorn. Caricatures of Darwin as Monkey Man, as you see here, proliferated. This is one from an 1878 issue of the French satirical journal La Petite Lune. Darwin's theories really had shaken many of the religious foundations of how we were thought to have originated, and it challenged us to look at the world in brand new ways. So the developments in science during the 19th century also had some spin-off developments as well. And one of those is in the development of the social sciences. So we start to see scholars applying the same principles of scientific investigations to human investigations as well too. So for example, we start to see the first real modern history writing in the 19th century. Leopold von Ranke was the first real historian to use primary sources as his evidence for an historical investigation. So when you are complaining about writing a primary source analysis, you can thank good old Leopold von Ranke. There also was the introduction of whole new disciplines of social sciences such as anthropology and other fields such as sociology, the science of society. Many of these early disciplines, unfortunately, were tainted by a warped view of Darwin's theory of evolution, something called social Darwinism, which we'll be talking about more later on in the course. And this was a sort of a racist twisting of the theory that imagined that the different races of human beings on the planet could be put into some form of a hierarchy. And of course, these scholars always put Europeans at the top of that hierarchy. Here you see an example of this sort of racist investigation into humans in this one of the 44 engravings on the subject of geography, geology, astronomy, and natural philosophy, published by James Redmans in London between 1850 and 1860, The Principal Varieties of Mankind. Of course, all of these theories were nonsense, but it was the first steps in social science that was taken during the 19th century. So what can we say about culture overall in the Age of Optimism in Europe, which was really an age of change? Well, Europeans certainly felt secure in their place in the world. They felt confident, and this was partially based on all of the developments and changes that had taken place in Europe in the 19th century. And as we've already said, there is a flip side, a nastier side to all of this, that Europeans were oppressing the rest of the world at the exact same time. But for Europeans, it was called La Belle Époque, or the Good Age, and it's epitomized by ambitious projects such as the building of the Eiffel Tower. Here you see a caricature of Gustave Eiffel comparing the Eiffel Tower to the pyramids. At the time, the Eiffel Tower was the tallest thing ever constructed by human beings. It was meant to stand just for 20 years and was constructed for the 1889 World's Fair in Paris. Of course, eventually Parisians came to at least tolerate the tower, and it still stands today. We also see other expressions of culture, particularly in the arts, which really began to change as well. And part of this was brought on by the invention of photography. If we have photography, what is art for? And so we really see two breakaway movements. One is the realists, and the realists are interested in not painting grand scenes of famous gods or moments in history, but rather painting the drudgery and the realistic view of life for everyday people. On the flip side of that were the Impressionists. Impressionists were directly revolting against the realistic depiction of the world through a photographer's lens, and instead tried to depict the emotion and the feeling of a moment in time. Here you see the painting that really started the Impressionistic movement by Claude Monet. It was entitled Impression Soleil Levant, and it became the source of the movement's name after an article about the exhibition where it was first shown declared that the painting was at most a sketch. Impression Sunrise depicts the port of Le Havre, which is Monet's hometown. And here you see an example of the realists. This is a painting by Gustave Courbet, The Stonebreakers. This 1849 painting depicts the rough existence of manual labors, the bleakness of the subject matter, and the style in which it was carried out characterized much of the realist school of arts. So realists were not interested in grand big moments in time, but rather the everyday life experience. So that's it for this week. Next week, we're going to move away from all this sickly, optimistic stuff, and we're going to be looking at the flip side of that age, which was imperialism. We will see the scramble for Africa. We'll see Europeans fighting over control of other parts of the world and the terrible oppression of the peoples who already lived there. We'll also see the building tension and militarism, which would ultimately lead to the First World War. The Age of Optimism, it was short-lived and really, was it that optimistic at all? See you next week.